The moment Elijah Hunter crouched down in the red Arizona dust and picked up that small silver brooch, he had no way of knowing it would change the entire course of his life. It was the kind of ordinary August morning in 1882 that a man could ride through without a second thought, the sun already pressing its full weight onto the backs of everything living and unliving across the Sonoran landscape. The trail from Tucson northward toward the settlement of Cedar Creek was well-worn but lonesome, cutting through scrub and saguaro, and the occasional dry wash that promised water and delivered only cracked earth. Elijah had been riding since before dawn, heading back to his small horse-breaking operation outside of Cedar Creek after spending 2 days in Tucson selling a string of 3 geldings to a cavalry remount officer at Fort Lowell. He had $42 folded in his shirt pocket, a fair enough sum, and his black and white paint horse, Domino, moved beneath him with the easy, rolling stride of an animal well-rested and well-fed. Elijah was 28 years old, lean in the way that men who worked outdoors became lean without trying, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and brown eyes that held a quality his mother had once called seeing eyes, meaning they took in more than they let on. He had a jaw that was rarely clean-shaven and hands that were rarely idle, and he possessed the particular kind of quiet that the West had a way of building into men who spent more time with horses than with people. He was not unfriendly. He was simply careful with words the way other men were careful with ammunition. He spotted the brooch when Domino shied slightly to one side, the horse having noticed the glint of metal half buried in the dust at the edge of the trail. Elijah pulled up, swung down, and picked it up. It was silver, about the size of a silver dollar, shaped like a small spray of leaves with what looked like a turquoise stone set at the center. It was a delicate thing, the kind of thing a woman wore pinned to the collar of a good dress on a Sunday or on a journey she cared about enough to dress nicely for. It was not the kind of thing a person would willingly leave behind. He turned it over in his palm. On the back, scratched in small, careful letters, were the initials SW. He stood there in the middle of that trail for a long moment, looking in both directions. The trail was empty in both directions. He looked at the surrounding dust and read it the way men who spent time tracking learned to read it, and he could see the marks of a wagon that had passed through sometime in the last day, maybe less. It had come from the south and gone north toward Cedar Creek, a loaded wagon by the depth of the wheel ruts. Someone moving, not just passing through. He should have pocketed it and moved on. He knew it. The reasonable thing, the practical thing, was to take it to the trading post in Cedar Creek and leave it there in case whoever had lost it came looking. He was a man with work waiting for him, 3 more young horses in his corral that needed handling, a fence line that had been needing repair for going on 2 weeks. He had no particular reason to make anything more of a silver brooch than a silver brooch, and yet he did not pocket it and move on. He turned it over again in the light, and something about the care with which those initials had been scratched into the silver told him that this brooch had not been bought to be left on a trail in the dust. Somebody had owned this thing long enough to put their name on it. He closed his fingers around it, swung back up into the saddle, and kept riding north. Cedar Creek in the summer of 1882 was a settlement of perhaps 300 souls working very hard to become a proper town. It had a general store that doubled as a post office, a livery, a blacksmith, a small hotel with 4 rooms that were usually occupied, a saloon called the Dusty Ace that did reliable business, a church that held services every Sunday in a building that smelled of new pine lumber, and a scattering of houses and homesteads radiating outward from those central establishments like spokes on a wheel that had not quite decided what shape it wanted to take. The land around Cedar Creek was good land for ranching and reasonable land for farming if a person was patient with it. And the territory was opening up enough in those years, after the Army had pushed south into Apache country, that new families were arriving with some regularity, building on parcels that had been set aside under the Homestead Act, trying their luck. When Elijah rode in late that afternoon, He went first to the livery to see to Domino, and then stopped at the general store, which was run by a compact, gray-whiskered man named Abe Tully, who knew most things that were known in Cedar Creek. "Looking for somebody," Elijah told Abe, setting the brooch on the counter between them. Abe picked it up, turned it over, and his expression did what expressions did when they recognized something. "SW," he said. "That be the Winslow woman. Come in 2 days ago with a hired man and a wagon full of household goods. She bought the old Mercer homestead out on the East Road, about 4 miles out. You find this on the trail, south of here, maybe 8 miles. Abe set the brooch back down on the counter and looked at Elijah with the measured interest of a man who collected information for its own sake. "She seems like a fine woman. Came all the way from St. Louis. Lost her husband about a year back, from what I understand. She has a younger sister with her, maybe 17 or 18 years old. Woman named Sarah Winslow. That is her property you are holding." Elijah nodded, picked up the brooch, and put it in his shirt pocket alongside his $42. "East Road," he said. 4 miles, give or take. You will see the turnoff. There is a big cottonwood at the fork." He thanked Abe and went to collect Domino, and he told himself all the way down the East Road that this was simply the right thing to do, that he was returning something that belonged to someone because that was what a person with a conscience did. And that was the entire beginning and end of it. He was not curious about the woman. He was not interested in a widow who had come from St. Louis with a wagon load of household goods and a younger sister, and what sounded like a life she was trying to rebuild from the ground up. He was not any of those things. He just rode down the East Road as the afternoon shadows stretched long across the scrub, found the cottonwood fork easily enough, and turned down a narrower track that wound between desert willow and mesquite toward a low adobe house that sat in the last of the day's golden light, as if someone had placed it there deliberately, the way you place something in a painting to give it peace. The first thing he saw was a woman on her knees in what would eventually become a kitchen garden, working the dry ground with a short-handled hoe, with a concentration that suggested she had not yet noticed him. She had dark auburn hair coiled at the back of her neck, and she wore a gray dress with the sleeves pushed to the elbows, and she was working that ground with the focused energy of someone who understood that the ground would only give back what you put into it. He stopped Domino at a respectful distance and said, "Excuse me, ma'am." She startled, came to her feet quickly, and turned around, and Elijah Hunter saw Sarah Winslow's face for the first time. She was perhaps 25, with green eyes that were immediately alert and direct, and a quality to her expression that suggested she had been through something hard enough to strip away anything that was not essential. She was not a fragile woman. She had the look of someone who had decided, somewhere in the last year, that fragile was not something she could afford to be. "I apologize for startling you," he said. He kept his hands easy and visible, as was courteous. "My name is Elijah Hunter. I have a small horse operation about 2 miles north of town. I found something on the trail south of here that I believe belongs to you." He reached into his shirt pocket and held out the brooch. Something happened to Sarah Winslow's face when she saw it. It was not the polite gratitude of someone recovering a pretty accessory. Her hand went to her mouth and her eyes went bright, and she crossed the distance between them in quick steps and took the brooch from his hand with both of hers, holding it the way people hold the things that matter most to them. "Where did you find this?" she said, and her voice was steady but just barely. "About 8 miles south, just at the edge of the trail. I almost rode past it. My horse noticed the glint first." She was quiet for a moment, turning the brooch over in her fingers the way he had turned it over on the trail. "This was my mother's," she said, more to herself than to him. "She gave it to me before she passed. I thought I had it safely pinned when we left Tucson, but the trail was rough." She looked up at him then, and the directness in her eyes was the kind that comes from genuine feeling unfiltered by social habit. "You rode 4 miles out here to return it." "It was the right thing," he said simply. She looked at him for a moment longer, assessing him with those green eyes the way, A woman who had been on her own long enough to need to assess things quickly tended to do. Then she said, "Mr. Hunter, I put a pot of beans on an hour ago and I baked cornbread this afternoon, and I would consider it an honor if you would stay for supper. It is the least I can do." He should have declined. He had ridden since before dawn, and he had work in the morning and a 20-year-old fence line that needed mending. And yet he looked at Sarah Winslow standing in the golden late afternoon light with her mother's brooch held in both hands and her sleeves pushed to her elbows and the kitchen garden half-hoed behind her, and he found that he did not want to decline at all. "I appreciate that, ma'am," he said. "I would be glad to." The inside of the Mercer house, which was already becoming the Winslow house in small but deliberate ways, was a single large room that served as kitchen and sitting room, with a smaller room partitioned off at the back that Elijah understood to be the sleeping quarters. The adobe walls were thick and kept the evening cool, and Sarah had hung curtains at the two front windows, pale yellow curtains that caught the last light and held it softly. There was a table made of good oak that had clearly traveled a long way from somewhere that had better lumber, and 4 chairs that matched it, and a rocking chair near the fireplace that had a quilt folded over its arm. On the mantel, a small framed daguerreotype stood next to a tin candle holder, and though Elijah did not look long enough to be impolite, he could see that the daguerreotype was of an older woman who had Sarah's same direct eyes. The younger sister, whose name turned out to be Clara Winslow, was 17 and had none of Sarah's careful stillness. She was all quick movement and quick words, and the kind of forthright curiosity that had not yet learned to disguise itself, and she spent the first 5 minutes of supper asking Elijah questions about horses with a directness that made him smile in spite of himself. "Do you break them yourself, or do you have men to help?" Clara asked, passing the cornbread without looking away from him. "Mostly myself," he said. "I have a Navajo man who works with me 2 days a week. His name is Thomas. He is better with horses than I am, though I have never told him that." "Why haven't you told him?" Clara asked. "Clara," Sarah said, with the tone of a woman who had been managing her younger sister's bluntness for a long time. "It is a fair question," Elijah said. "The honest answer is that I have probably implied it enough times that he knows. He just lets me pretend otherwise." Clara laughed, and Sarah smiled, and that was the moment Elijah noticed the way Sarah Winslow smiled, which was a small and private thing, not the wide performed smile of a woman trying to be charming, but something that came from somewhere genuine and arrived with a quality of warmth that was all the more powerful for being unplanned. They ate beans and cornbread, and Sarah had put up a jar of green tomato preserves that she set on the table, and the conversation moved through the easy territories of new arrivals and established settlers, through what the land was like and what the seasons did to it, through the nearest doctor, who was in Tucson and that was a problem, and through the quality of the soil in the kitchen garden, which Sarah had already determined was going to require more work than the man who sold her the property had suggested. "He was not dishonest," she said carefully, in the tone of someone who was being fair at some cost. "He simply chose not to mention certain things." "That is a diplomatic way of saying he was not entirely honest," Elijah said. "I prefer to think of it as incomplete information," Sarah said, and there was a dry humor in it that surprised him and delighted him in equal measure. "What made you choose this particular territory?" he asked. "Forgive me if that is too personal." She was quiet for a moment, not in the way of someone deciding whether to answer, but in the way of someone deciding how to answer accurately. "My husband passed away 14 months ago. He had been ill for some time before that. We were incensed. Louis and I stayed because of him, and then because of the practicalities that follow losing someone, and then one morning I understood that I had been staying out of habit and that habit was not a good enough reason." She looked at her hands around her coffee cup. "I had read about Arizona territory. I wanted land that was mine. Clara wanted to come. It seemed like a beginning." Elijah nodded. He knew something about choosing a place because it felt like the possibility of a beginning rather than the continuation of something already finished. "What about you?" she asked. "You have been in Cedar Creek long." "4 years," he said. "I came from Texas. My family had a cattle operation in the hill country, but my father passed and the land went to debt and what was left went to my older brother, which was how it should have been. I came west looking for what it is most men come west looking for." "And did you find it?" Sarah asked. The question was genuine, not rhetorical. He thought about it. "Some of it," he said honestly. "The horses' work I love. The land suits me. The solitary aspect of it suits me perhaps a little too well. My mother writes and tells me I should have married by now." He had not meant to say that last part. He was not accustomed to saying things he had not planned to say, and he registered his own surprise at having said it. Clara looked between the two of them with the unsubtle radar of a younger sister, and then very deliberately looked at her cornbread. "Mothers have opinions," Sarah said, and there was something in her tone that acknowledged without saying it directly that she understood the weight of other people's expectations about a woman's life. He stayed 2 hours past supper. The conversation moved through horses and land and scent. Louis and the particular quality of Arizona sunsets and the problem of water in dry country and a dozen other things, and at no point did it feel like the careful navigation of strangers. It felt more like the ease of people who have been reading the same book and arrived at the same chapter without having planned to. When he finally stood to leave, saying it was a long ride back and he had an early morning, Sarah walked him out to where Domino was tied at the post near the fence. The stars were extraordinary over the desert. They always were, out here away from the smoke and light of even a small town, and the silence had the quality of something active rather than merely empty. "Thank you again," Sarah said, her hand at her collar where the brooch was now pinned. "I cannot tell you what this means to me. You did not have to ride out here. Most people would have left it at the trading post and considered their duty done." "I considered that," he said honestly, swinging up onto Domino. "What made you ride out instead?" He looked down at her in the starlight, at the directness of her face and the still present quality of relief in her expression that told him what the brooch carried. "The initials," he said. "Someone put their name on it. Something with someone's name on it deserves to be returned personally." She looked at him for a moment and then she said quietly, "I hope you will come back sometime, Mr. Hunter. Not on an errand, just to visit." He touched his hat brim. "I believe I will, Mrs. Winslow. Good night." He rode back to his place in the dark with Domino picking the trail easily and the stars overhead and the warm desert air moving over him, and he was aware of a peculiar feeling, a kind of settling, as if something in him that had been slightly out of alignment had shifted back into place. He told himself it was simply the satisfaction of having done a good thing. He told himself that several times on the way home, which probably indicated that he did not fully believe it. The fence line got its repairs the next morning, and the 3 young horses in the corral got their daily work, and Thomas, the Navajo horseman who helped him, came by on the second day, and they worked a particularly difficult bay roan together with the patience that good horse work required. Elijah said nothing about the woman on the east road or the brooch or the supper, but Thomas was a perceptive man who noticed things without announcing that he had noticed them, and on the second day he said, as they leaned on the fence watching the bay roan move in the round corral, "You have been somewhere in your mind the last 2 days. Just thinking about things," Elijah said. "That is what I said," Thomas replied, which was the end of the conversation. On Saturday, Elijah went into Cedar Creek for supplies. He had a list that required flour and salt and a new cinch ring for Domino's saddle and a small amount of kerosene. He accomplished these things at Abe Tully's store and was securing the flour to his saddle bags outside when he heard a woman's voice behind him say his name. He turned and it was Sarah Winslow, coming along the main street with Clara beside her and a basket on her arm, and the sight of her in the morning light in a blue dress with her auburn hair properly pinned, and the silver brooch at her collar was a sight that went through him with more force than he had prepared for. "Mr. Hunter," she said, with that small, genuine smile, "you are a man who is good at appearing exactly when expected." "I was not aware I was expected," he said. "I did not mean that literally," she said, and there was warmth and humor in it that he was coming to understand was very particular to her. Clara said hello with her usual frank energy, and then spotted something in the store window that required immediate investigation, and excused herself with the complete transparency of someone who was not actually interested in the window display. They stood in the street together and talked for a quarter of an hour, about nothing that was particularly important, and everything that mattered in the way that conversations matter when the person you are having them with is someone you have been thinking about. He learned that the kitchen garden was progressing, and that she had discovered the well behind the house needed resealing, which was an expense she had not anticipated. He told her about the bay roan and why the difficult horses were always the most interesting ones. "I think that is true of people as well," she said, with the dry humor he was coming to treasure. He laughed. It felt clean and uncomplicated in a way laughter sometimes did not. "I wonder," he said, before thinking about whether to say it or not, "if you might allow me to look at that well for you. I have resealed a well before. It is not complicated work and I have the materials." She looked at him steadily, and he understood that she was deciding something about what accepting help meant and how she wanted to stand in relation to needing it, which was a thing a woman managing her own property in rough country would think carefully about. "I would not want to impose on your time," she said. "You would not be imposing," he said. "You would be letting me be useful. There is a difference." A beat of quiet, and then she said, "Tuesday if the morning suits you." "Tuesday morning," he agreed. He spent Sunday evening thinking about that, and telling himself various reasonable things about neighbors and practical assistance, and the general nature of community life on the frontier, none of which addressed the fact that he had already been looking forward to Tuesday since Saturday. He rode out Tuesday morning with his tools and the necessary materials for a well seal, and the job took until midday, the work requiring him to go down into the well shaft with a rope for purchase and work the soft mortar into the cracks around the stone lining, while Sarah held the rope at the top, and Clara sat on the well's edge reading aloud from a novel she had brought from St. Louis, maintaining a running commentary on the novel's romantic elements that was clearly directed at both her sister and Elijah in equal measure, with the cheerful shamelessness of a 17-year-old who considered subtlety an unnecessary complication. "This heroine has turned down 3 perfectly good proposals," Clara announced, turning a page. "I think she is being unreasonably particular." "Perhaps she is waiting to be certain," Sarah said, not looking up from where she was watching the rope with entirely unnecessary focus, given that Elijah was doing fine and they both knew it. "Certainty takes time," Clara said. "But some people let time become an excuse for not deciding anything at all." Elijah, in the well, heard all of this perfectly clearly and kept his expression entirely neutral when he climbed back up. They had lunch on the flat wooden table in the shade behind the house, cold roast beef and bread and summer squash that Sarah had cooked the night before, and it was easy and comfortable in the way that the supper had been easy and comfortable. The same quality of meeting in the middle of something shared rather than standing at polite distances from each other. Clara abandoned them after lunch to attend to something she referred to vaguely as a project, and Elijah and Sarah sat at the table in the shade and talked until the afternoon shadows started to lengthen, and neither of them moved to end it. He learned that day about her husband, whose name had been Robert Winslow, a merchant who had been kind and decent, and who had been a good husband, and who had suffered from a condition of the lungs for the last 3 years of his life. She spoke of him with the measured honesty of someone who had done enough grieving to arrive at something beyond it, at a place where the grief was present but not consuming, where the person could be remembered as a whole person rather than as a wound. She did not romanticize and she did not diminish. She simply told the truth. He told her about his father, about the cattle operation that had not survived the combination of 2 drought years, and a man who was more stubborn than was wise, about the particular grief of watching a thing your father built come apart and being unable to stop it, about the guilt that follows even when there was nothing to be guilty for. "You came west to stop feeling like you had failed him," she said. He had never said that to anyone. He had barely said it to himself in so many words. "Something like that," he said. "Did it work?" "Some days," he said honestly. "The horsework helps. Building something that is actually mine helps. Some days it does not work at all and the guilt just sits there." She nodded as if that made complete and exact sense to her, which he suspected it did. "I think we build things," she said quietly, "because building is the only answer to the things we cannot change. You cannot go back and save the ranch. I cannot go back and give Robert more years. But there is a well on my property that needed sealing, and now it is sealed." He looked at her for a long moment. "That is very well put," he said. She met his eyes without deflecting the look, and something passed between them in that moment that was more honest than either of them had quite meant to be, and more welcome for it. He went home that evening with the sense that something was happening, something that had nothing to do with fence lines and well seals and flour from Abe Tully's store. It was the kind of thing that grew quietly, without announcement, in the way that things which intend to last tend to grow. The following weeks moved with the particular rhythm of August and September on the Arizona frontier, the days of intense heat giving way gradually to the first suggestion of autumn, the quality of the light changing in the late afternoons to something more golden and forgiving. Elijah found reasons to ride out to the Winslow homestead with a frequency that a man of perfect honesty with himself would have acknowledged were not all purely practical. And Sarah Winslow found reasons to be working near the fence line, or in the kitchen garden, or on the porch when he arrived that were similarly not all coincidental. He helped her build out the kitchen garden beds with proper borders to keep moisture in. She sent him home with jars of the first harvest, tomatoes and chilies and herbs she had managed to coax from the reluctant desert soil with a stubbornness that impressed him greatly. He brought her a piece of harness leather one afternoon because she had mentioned needing to repair the strap on one of her trunks, and stayed 3 hours past delivering it, because the conversation about the harness led to a conversation about where he had learned to work leather, and that led to a story about a saddle maker in San Antonio who had told him that leather work was the same as character work. It required patience, and it showed every mistake. "He sounds like a wise man," Sarah said. "He was also the most impatient man I have ever met," Elijah said. "He could not wait 3 minutes for coffee to cool. He burned his tongue every single morning." She laughed, fully and freely, throwing her head back slightly, and it was the first time he had heard her laugh like that, without the small, contained quality that she usually kept in place, and it struck him somewhere in the chest with a clarity that he could not attribute to anything other than the plain truth. He was in love with her. He did not say this to her. He was not a man who led with declarations. He was a man who was careful with words, and had learned from years of working with animals that sudden movements frightened things worth keeping. And he understood that Sarah Winslow was a woman who had rebuilt herself carefully after a significant loss, and that she deserved to be approached with patience and with respect for the pace she set. But he knew it clearly, the way you know the weather is about to change because the horses are restless and the light has a certain quality, and you have been in this country long enough to read its signs. Clara knew it too. Clara, whose subtlety filter operated on a completely different frequency than normal human beings, told him one morning when Sarah had gone inside to fetch coffee and they were standing at the corral fence watching Domino, "You should tell her how you feel." "I appreciate the advice," he said. "She thinks about you," Clara said, with the calm delivery of someone stating observable fact. "She does not say so, but she does." She was already working on the fence that faces the east road when you arrived last Tuesday, and she never works on that side of the property unless she is watching for someone. "That could mean anything," he said. "It could mean several things," Clara agreed pleasantly, and most of them support my point." He shook his head, but he was smiling. "She was happy in St. Louis," Clara said, and her voice had changed slightly, taken on a quality that was less the frank teenager and more a younger sister who loved her older one very much and was saying something careful. "She was, I think, a different kind of happy than she is here. Robert was a good man and she cared for him, but they were very different people, and I think she spent a great deal of time making herself fit a shape that was not entirely her own. When he passed and she decided to come here, it was the first time I had seen her choose purely for herself. I do not want to see her talk herself out of something good because she is afraid of what it might cost." Elijah was quiet for a moment. "She has not said any of that to me," he said carefully. "She would not," Clara said. "She says it in the way she works that garden at 6 in the morning and stays out until her arms give out. She says it in the way she talks about this land like it belongs to her already, all of it, the dry parts and the rocky parts. She says it in the way she smiles when you ride in." She paused. "I am 17, Mr. Hunter, not blind." He said nothing to this because there was nothing to say. He just watched Domino stand peacefully in the corral and felt the warmth of a September morning on his back and thought about a woman who chose for herself for the first time and deserved to be met in that choice by someone who saw her clearly. The difficulty, of course, was not in the feeling. The difficulty, as is generally the case in human affairs, was in finding the right moment and the right words to say what was true without making it clumsy. October arrived in Cedar Creek with a coolness in the mornings that the desert air wore lightly, like a concession rather than a commitment. The aspen on the higher ground to the north had gone gold, visible from the valley as a band of brightness on the dark slopes, and the light had that particular October quality that made even ordinary things look considered, as if the world had taken some care with its arrangement. Elijah had been asked by the local ranching community to contribute 2 horses to a cattle drive that was taking a herd east, a drive that would take the better part of 3 weeks and require him to ride with the outfit as far as the New Mexico line to bring the horses back. It was good money and work he had committed to before the summer, before the East Road and the Cottonwood Fork, and a woman on her knees in a kitchen garden, and he could not in good conscience withdraw from the commitment. He went out to the Winslow homestead on the Monday before he was scheduled to leave and found Sarah on the porch, restitching the cover of a book, working with the small scissors and thread of a woman who had grown up understanding that things cared for lasted. She looked up when he rode in, and there was that familiar quality in her expression, the look that he had learned to read as its own kind of welcome. "I need to tell you something," he said, swinging down and tying Domino. "I am leaving Thursday for 3 weeks with a cattle drive heading east. I want you to know before I go, in case you need anything while I am away. Thomas will be at my place. He is a reliable man and he will help you if anything needs doing." She set down the book and the scissors. 3 weeks, she said. "I committed to it before summer. I cannot withdraw." "I am not asking you to withdraw," she said quickly. "I just—" She stopped and then said something that he could see she had not quite intended to say out loud. "I will miss having you nearby." The quiet between them after that held everything that had been building through August and September and October, all the Tuesday mornings and kitchen garden conversations and late afternoon shadows, and Elijah Hunter, who was careful with words, looked at Sarah Winslow on her porch with her book in her lap and the afternoon light in her hair, and decided that careful was its own kind of cowardice if it became an excuse for silence. He walked up the 2 porch steps and stood before her and said, "Sarah, I would like to speak plainly if you will allow it." She looked up at him, and her eyes were very direct and very still. "Please," she said. "I have been coming out here every week, and I have told myself a variety of useful reasons for doing so, and every one of them is true, and none of them is the whole truth. The whole truth is that I come because being here with you is the best part of my weeks. It is the best part of my month. It is the thing I think about when I am working, and the thing I am already looking forward to the next time I leave. I do not know what to do with that except to say it plainly so that you know it, and so that, when I come back from this drive in 3 weeks, we can talk about what it means if you have any inclination to do so." He had not taken his hat off when he walked up the steps, which he now recognized as an oversight, and he remedied it, holding it in front of him, which was perhaps too late for the gesture to fully recover its timing, but he made it anyway. Sarah Winslow looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something he had not predicted. She stood up from the chair and she put one hand briefly against his arm, not grasping, just a touch, and she said, "Elijah, I have been hoping for 3 weeks that you might say something like that." "You have been hoping for 3 weeks," he said. "At least 3 weeks," she said, with the dry humor that he now recognized as one of her truest qualities. He laughed, and she laughed, and then they were standing very close together on the porch in the October afternoon light, and he was looking at her with all the feeling he had been carefully containing, and she was looking at him with hers, and it was the most honest and uncomplicated moment he could remember having in a very long time. He did not kiss her then. She had been widowed and had come a long way and had built something here for herself, and she deserved to be courted properly, not kissed on a porch because the moment was convenient. He had more respect for her than that. But he took her hand and held it for a moment, and she held his, and that was enough. It was more than enough. It was the beginning of something they both understood. He left on Thursday as planned, riding out with the cattle drive in the cool early morning, and he thought about her every day for 3 weeks with the steady and undiminished quality of something that had made up its mind. He wrote her one letter from a town called Lordsburg, near the New Mexico line, and in it he said several things about the drive and the country he was passing through, and one thing about how the desert, even at a distance, made him think of home in a way he had not expected, and she would understand what he meant by that. She did understand what he meant, because when he returned in November she met him on the porch and handed him a letter she had written but had not known where to send, and in it she had said several things about the garden and Clara's ongoing opinions on various subjects, and one thing about how she found herself marking time in a way she had not done in a very long time. He read the letter on the porch while she watched, and when he finished it, he folded it carefully and put it in his breast pocket over his heart, which he was aware was perhaps too obvious a gesture, but which was also the exact truth of his intention. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what it would mean to be courting you properly. I would like to do that." "You have been doing that for 3 months," she said. "I think you are simply looking for permission to name it." "Then I am asking for that permission," he said. "You have it," she said. They spent November in the particular sweetness of a courtship that was honest about itself. Two people in their mid-20s who had both lived enough to know what mattered and what did not, and who were old enough to take it seriously and young enough to take it joyfully. He came out on Tuesdays and Saturdays. She came into Cedar Creek on Fridays with Clara, and they would meet at Abe Tully's store, and then walk to the small hotel, where there was a dining room that served meals on Friday evenings, and they would eat and talk for 2 hours with Clara, opposite them, maintaining the fiction that she was reading whatever novel she had brought while actually monitoring everything with frank interest. He told her more about Texas and about his brother, whose name was Daniel, who had written twice since Elijah left, and whose letters were always the letters of a man who was not sure what to say but was trying. She told him more about Robert, about the early years of the marriage when she had been young, and had thought that building a good marriage meant learning to want what your husband wanted, and about the gradual understanding that this was not quite the same as happiness. "I am not ungrateful for those years," she said clearly. "They made me understand what I actually need. I am not sure I could have come to Arizona and taken this land, and decided it was mine without having first learned what it felt like to be in a life that did not fit. You have to know the wrong thing to recognize the right one." He thought about that for a long time afterward. In December, Cedar Creek had a hard frost that killed what was left of Sarah's garden, but left the root vegetables intact, which she considered a satisfactory outcome. Elijah brought out a cord of firewood he had cut from the dead mesquite on the back of his property, and they stacked it together against the south wall of the house, while Clara made coffee inside, and the December air had a bite to it that felt, for the first time in the territory, almost familiar. While they were stacking wood, he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that there is no pressure in either direction. You may answer however honestly you like." She set down the piece of mesquite she was holding and turned to face him. "All right," she said. "Would you consider marrying me?" he said. "I am not asking you to decide now. I am asking you whether it is something you would consider. Because I love you, Sarah, and I think you know that, and if you love me too, I would like to make a life with you here. Both properties, both of us, building something together. But I mean it when I say there is no pressure. You have built something here for yourself, and I would never ask you to give that up for something smaller." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with those green eyes that held everything and gave away exactly as much as she intended. "Elijah," she said, "I love you. I have loved you since probably that Tuesday you were in the bottom of my well and Clara was reading aloud about proposals, and I realized I would give a great deal to be the subject of one from you." She took a breath. "Yes, I will marry you." He took her face in both hands, gently, and kissed her for the first time. There in the cold December air with the mesquite wood piled against the south wall, and the smell of coffee coming from inside the house. And it was everything that a first kiss is supposed to be when it follows 3 months of absolute honesty and attention and care. Inside, Clara, who was watching from the window with the complete lack of shame of a younger sister who was also correct about everything, said out loud to no one in particular, "Finally." They were married in the Cedar Creek Church on the 14th of February, 1883, which was Clara's suggestion, and which everyone agreed was almost too fitting. Reverend Aldous Morris, who was a large, red-faced man with a surprisingly gentle voice, performed the ceremony in front of approximately 40 people, which was most of Cedar Creek, because in small settlements in 1883, a wedding was both a social event and a statement about the future of the place, and people showed up for that. Sarah wore a dress she had altered from one of her mother's, a cream-colored wool that she had taken in and re-hemmed over several evenings in January, while Elijah sat at her table reading, and occasionally handing her things when she needed a hand without thread in it. She had the silver brooch pinned at her collar. He noticed it immediately when he turned to see her walking to him down the aisle, and the sight of it in that moment on that day was something he would carry for the rest of his life. He wore his good dark coat and a white shirt Clara had pressed for him that morning with the iron she heated on the stove, and he stood at the front of the church and watched Sarah come toward him and felt the kind of certainty that does not tremble. Thomas was there, sitting in the back of the church in his good shirt, and Abe Tully was there with his wife Alina, and the neighboring ranchers and homesteaders were there, and the woman who ran the hotel dining room was there with her husband, and all of Cedar Creek was there in its 40-person entirety. And when Reverend Morris said the words and they said theirs, the quality of the silence in that pine-smelling church was the kind of silence that means everyone present believes in what is happening. They said their vows clearly and without hesitation, looking at each other without looking away, because they were people who had been honest with each other from the beginning, and they saw no reason to change that practice when it came to the most important words they would ever say. They moved their lives together in the weeks that followed, which was a practical project involving decisions about which items from each household to keep and where to keep them, and the question of which property to primarily occupy. They chose the Winslow homestead on the East Road because it had more kitchen garden space, and because Sarah had already put too much into that ground to leave it, and they rode out together every few days to attend to the horse operation, which continued to provide their main income. The combining of two households is both a practical and an intimate project, requiring negotiations about small things that are not really about small things, and they navigated it with the same honesty and humor they had brought to everything else. He had more gear and tools than he had furniture, and she had more furniture than tools, and together they made a complete household out of the sum of both, which seemed to Elijah like a reasonable metaphor for what they were doing overall. Thomas came to work with them 3 days a week now, and he brought his own calm authority to the operation that made everything run more smoothly, and Sarah had almost immediately established the kind of relationship with him that was based on mutual respect for competence, which Thomas appreciated and which Elijah watched with quiet pride. Clara was with them for the first year, 17 becoming 18 in March, with a birthday supper that Sarah made from scratch, and that Elijah contributed to by catching and smoking a rabbit, which Clara deemed an excellent birthday contribution, even if she was slightly squeamish about where it had started. And then 18 becoming 19, with the increasing independence and self-direction of a young woman who was deciding what her own life was going to look like. She helped Sarah with the garden and the household, and occasionally helped Elijah with the horses, at which she turned out to have some natural aptitude that Thomas recognized and quietly encouraged. In the spring of 1883, a young man named Will Decker began appearing at the East Road homestead, with a regularity that was not entirely explained by his stated interest in purchasing one of Elijah's horses. He was 20, the son of a ranching family from the northern part of the territory, reasonably well-spoken and apparently earnest, and he directed the majority of his conversations at Clara with the transparent determination of a young man who had decided on something and was working toward it with all his effort. Clara, for her part, was not indifferent. She was deliberate, in the way that a young woman who had watched her older sister navigate both loss and love tended to be deliberate, but she was not indifferent. "What do you think of Will Decker?" Sarah asked Elijah one evening while they were sitting on the porch in the warm April evening, the way they did most evenings now, him with his coffee and her with the book she was reading, and the two of them in the easy companionship of people who had made a home out of the space between them. "I think he is young," Elijah said, "and honest and more capable than he currently looks because he has not had to be tested yet. I think he looks at Clara the way a man should look at a woman he intends to build a life with." "You checked," Sarah said with a small smile. "I pay attention," he said, which was not a denial. "She is only 19, Sarah said. "You are not much older," he pointed out gently. She considered this. "True," she said. "I just want her to be choosing for herself, truly for herself." "Watch her eyes when he is talking to her," Elijah said. "Not when she is talking, when she is listening. That is where the answer is." Sarah looked at him with a quality of warmth that he had come to understand was the specific warmth she reserved for moments when he said something that surprised her with its accuracy. "When did you become wise?" she said. "I have been spending time with a very perceptive woman," he said. "It is improving me." She leaned over and kissed him briefly on the cheek, which was the kind of gesture that seemed small and was actually enormous, the kind of casual tenderness that means two people have gotten somewhere past the formal country of new love and into the warm interior of something permanent. By the summer of 1883, Elijah and Sarah Winslow Hunter, which was how she had taken to signing things with the particular pleasure of a woman who liked her full name, had settled into the life they had begun to build. The horse operation was doing well enough that they had been able to hire a second hand, a young man from down near Tombstone who was quiet and reliable and could sit a young horse with patience. The kitchen garden had expanded to a quarter-acre and was producing abundantly, and Sarah had begun selling the surplus at Abe Tully's store, dried chilies and herbs and preserved tomatoes, the kind of small commerce that spoke to both her practicality and her pleasure in the work. They were not rich people. They were people who worked hard for everything they had and who counted the worth of what they were building in things more durable than money, in the solidity of the adobe walls and the depth of the well and the quality of the horses coming out of their corral, and the size of the kitchen garden, and the evenings on the porch, and the mornings that began before dawn, and ended with the specific satisfaction of work, that is also a form of love. There were difficulties, because this was Arizona territory in 1883, and difficulty was built into the landscape along with the beauty. There was a drought in the summer that made the water situation serious for 2 months, and there was a dispute with a neighboring homesteader over a boundary line that required several difficult conversations and the eventual intervention of a surveyor from Tucson. There was a late frost that killed the first planting of the spring garden and required a complete replanting in mid-April. There was a night in September when a sick horse kept them both up until 3 in the morning, taking turns with the animal, who recovered, but cost them sleep and worry in equal measure. And there was the moment, in October of 1883, when Elijah rode back from Cedar Creek and found Sarah sitting at the kitchen table with a look on her face that he had not seen before, a look of someone who is absorbing news that requires some adjusting to. He sat down across from her without speaking, waiting, which was one of his best qualities. "I am going to have a child," she said. She looked at him with those green eyes that always showed him the truth. "I was not entirely certain until this week. I am certain now." The feeling that went through Elijah Hunter in that moment was not easily reducible to a single word. It was large and warm and frightened and full of a quality of wonder that he had not anticipated, and it made him reach across the table and take both her hands and hold them, and he found that his voice, which was usually reliable, required a moment to cooperate. "Sarah," he said finally. "Yes," she said, understanding whatever he meant by that. "Are you all right?" he asked. "How are you feeling?" "Tired," she said honestly, "and a little frightened, and very glad." "All three seem appropriate," he said. "The doctor is in Tucson," she said, which was the practical concern that underlay everything. "We will go to Tucson when the time comes," he said immediately. "We will plan for it. You will have a proper doctor. We will make that arrangement now ahead of time so there is nothing left to chance." She looked at him for a moment, and he saw relief move through her, not because she had expected otherwise, but because hearing it plainly said was its own kind of comfort. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said. "All three of you." She laughed, which was still one of his favorite sounds in the world. And then she was crying a little, which was fine, and he came around the table and held her. And outside the October desert had gone gold in the afternoon light, and the cottonwood at the fork of the East Road was shedding its leaves in the warm wind, and the whole world had the quality of a thing settling perfectly into its own right shape. Clara took the news with the intense delight of a soon-to-be aunt, who immediately began advocating for names she preferred and scheduling arrangements she had opinions about. Thomas, when told in the way that the people who were part of your working life, and who had become something more than employees and less than family, but were in fact something of both, needed to be told, simply looked at Elijah with an expression of genuine warmth and said, "Good." The winter of 1883 and into 1884 was a period of preparation and anticipation. They made a trip to Tucson in November to establish themselves with a physician there, a Dr. Harmon who was competent and direct, and they arranged that Sarah would go to Tucson in the late spring when the child was near its time. They spent the cold months with the indoor work that winter required, and in the long evenings by the fire Elijah read aloud from the novels Sarah had brought from St. Louis, and she did needlework, and they talked about everything, and nothing in the easy and inexhaustible way of people who have found that the company of the specific other person is the best company available. He wrote to his brother Daniel in Texas, telling him the news, and Daniel wrote back within the month, a longer letter than he usually managed, with a warmth in it that said something about what distance and time had done for their relationship, wearing away the old friction into something smoother. Daniel's wife had sent a length of good blue cotton flannel, fine enough for infant clothing without being asked, which Sarah held in her hands for a moment before putting it carefully in the new chest they had made for the baby's things. "I would like us to visit them someday," Sarah said. "Daniel and his family." "I would like that too," Elijah said, and meant it in a way he had not entirely expected to mean it. In March, Clara made a decision about her own life that she announced at the supper table one Thursday evening with the directness that had always been her primary mode. "Will Decker has asked me to marry him," she said, "and I have told him yes. I want you both to know that I am entirely certain about it, so the part of the conversation where you check whether I am certain is already covered." Sarah looked at her sister for a long moment, and then she looked at Elijah, who looked back at her with the expression of a man who had told her to watch Clara's eyes when Will Decker talked. "Are you happy?" Sarah asked. "Very," Clara said simply, and that was the whole answer. "Then we are happy for you," Sarah said, and got up from the table to embrace her sister. And Elijah reached across and shook Clara's hand and then thought better of it and stood up and hugged her, which made Clara laugh in the wholehearted way she always laughed. The wedding was planned for June, which gave them all something to look forward to through the last cold months. Will Decker came and asked for a conversation with Elijah, man to man, with the earnest formality of a young man who took the gesture seriously, and Elijah told him plainly that he thought highly of him, and that his only concern in the matter was Clara's happiness, and that Clara's happiness appeared to be intact, so his blessing was given without reservation. Will shook his hand with a grip that said more than he could put into words, which Elijah understood and respected. Sarah went to Tucson in late April, Elijah riding beside the wagon all the way, with Thomas managing the property in their absence. They stayed in a boarding house in Tucson, run by a woman named Mrs. Caldwell, who was accustomed to families in exactly this situation, and who provided the kind of competent and warm management of the practical details that was its own form of grace. The child was born on the 9th of May, 1884, in the first hours of a warm Tucson morning, and it was a boy, delivered by Dr. Harmon, with Sarah working harder than she had ever worked at anything and Elijah in the next room doing the worst waiting of his life, until he heard the sound that meant everything had come right. They named him James Robert Hunter, James for Elijah's father and Robert for Sarah's husband, who had been a good man and deserved a form of remembrance. And this decision was entirely Sarah's and entirely right, and Elijah agreed without hesitation because it was right. He held his son for the first time in the clean, bright morning light of the Tucson boarding house, this small and complete and absolutely serious-faced person who had just arrived in the world and who was already looking at everything with the focused intensity of someone who intended to understand it. And he felt the full weight of it, which was the weight of something that could not be measured. Sarah watched him holding James from the bed, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders and her face worn with the work she had just done and also radiant with something that had no better name than joy, and she said, "He looks serious." "He does," Elijah agreed. "He looks like you when you are trying to figure something out," she said. He looked at James and then at Sarah, and then at James again, and then he sat carefully on the edge of the bed and held his son in the crook of one arm and put the other around his wife's shoulders, and the three of them were in the morning light together, and he could not think of a single thing that was missing. They brought James Robert Hunter home to the East Road homestead at the end of May, and the desert in late May had the quality of every spring it had ever had, relentless and wild and absolutely committed to itself. The saguaro blooming white at the tops and the palo verde gone yellow, and the air carrying the smell of warm earth and distant rain. And Elijah thought as he rode alongside the wagon with the reins loose in his hands and Sarah holding James beside him, and the great open sky above all of it, that if a man had asked him 4 years ago whether he would be here, in this particular life, in this particular richness, he would not have been able to picture it. He had not been looking for this. He had been looking for a place to start over and a way to work that gave him peace, and he had ridden down the right trail on the right morning and found a piece of silver in the dust with a woman's name on it, and the entire accumulated weight of everything that followed, from the supper invitation to the well seal to the Tuesday mornings, and the December wood pile, and the church, and the vows, and the boy sleeping in his wife's arms in the wagon beside him. All of it traced back to a paint horse shying at a glint of light on a dusty trail 8 miles south of Cedar Creek. He thought about that. He thought about how life was composed of these small pivot points, these moments so ordinary they barely registered as moments at all, where a man could as easily have ridden past and made some other life, some lesser life, some life that worked well enough but was not this. He was profoundly grateful that Domino had good eyes. Clara's wedding in June was the occasion for general celebration in Cedar Creek and the surrounding properties, and it was held outdoors in the yard of the East Road homestead, because the June morning was perfect, the kind of perfect that the desert gave you without warning as recompense for its harder days. Clara wore a white dress Sarah had made for her over 4 weeks of evening work while nursing James, which was a feat of dedication that Elijah considered extraordinary, and that Clara wore with the particular confidence of a girl who had grown up knowing she was loved. Will Decker married Clara with an expression of transparent happiness that made several of the ranching women in attendance exchange smiles, and Clara married Will with the complete certainty she had announced at the supper table, and which had never wavered. They were setting up their household on the Decker family's northern property, and there were a few weeks in July after the wedding where the East Road homestead was quieter without Clara's energy in it, and Sarah said one evening that she had not fully appreciated how much space Clara's personality occupied until it was occupying a different house. "It will be different," Elijah agreed, "but she will be close enough." "I know," Sarah said, with James asleep on her shoulder, her hand moving slowly up and down his small back. "I am not sad, I am just adjusting." "That is all right," he said. "Adjusting is how you arrive somewhere new." She looked at him over James's sleeping head. "That is almost exactly what I said to you the first night you stayed for supper," she said, "about building things being the only answer to what cannot be changed." "You have been improving me for 2 years," he said. "It was bound to show up." She smiled, the full and private smile that was still one of the best things he knew. They spent the summer of 1884 in the daily work of the homestead and the horse operation and the early months of parenthood, which was exhausting and funny and occasionally frightening, and constantly astonishing. James was a serious child who observed the world with concentrated attention, and there was something about this that Elijah found both recognizable and deeply moving, watching his son look at everything with the care of someone who intends to understand it. Thomas had a quiet investment in James that expressed itself in small practical gestures, appearing at the homestead on the days he was not needed for horses with a length of good leather he had cut into soft pieces for the baby to grip, or with a carved wooden horse that had taken what was clearly several evenings of work to complete. These gestures were given without comment and received in the same spirit, with a gratitude that did not need to be stated at length. In the fall of 1884, Elijah and Sarah made the trip to Texas that they had been planning, leaving Thomas in charge of both the horses and the homestead with complete confidence, and taking James in the careful way that traveling with an infant required. They were gone 3 weeks, and they spent most of it at Daniel's ranch in the hill country, and the reunion between the two brothers was initially awkward in the way of men who have been at a distance long enough that they are no longer sure of the rules, and then gradually warm, and then genuinely warm, in the way of people who share something deep enough that it survives the neglect of years. Daniel's wife Ruth was a practical, generous woman who had views on everything and the intelligence to back them up, and Sarah and Ruth got along immediately with the particular ease of two women who recognized in each other a fellow person who had decided to be capable rather than to be managed. Daniel's 2 children, a boy of 6 named Caleb and a girl of 4 named Me, took to James with the enthusiastic authority of older children encountering a baby, and the hill country house was full of the specific happy noise of family. On the last evening there, sitting on Daniel's porch with the Texas dark around them and the stars doing what they always did in that country, Daniel said to Elijah, "You look different than you did when you left." 4 years will do that, Elijah said. It is not age, Daniel said. It is more like, he paused, searching. It is like when a horse that has been running too long finally slows down and you can see it settling into itself. Like you are in the right place. Elijah looked out at the Texas dark and thought about the right place. He thought about the desert and the east road and the kitchen garden and the silver brooch in the dust and a woman with green eyes who had asked him to stay for supper. "I am," he said. "I am very much in the right place." They came home to Arizona in October, and the desert welcomed them back with the particular quality of desert autumn, the light going amber and the air carrying something that was not quite chill, but was cooler than summer. And as they came down the east road in the wagon with James in Sarah's arms and the familiar cottonwood at the fork sending its last leaves down in the evening wind, Elijah felt the word home settle in him with absolute conviction. The years that followed, and this is not a way of skipping over them, because each of those years was full of its own specific texture and meaning, but rather a way of saying that the shape of the life they built together held true, had the quality of a thing that had been built right and settled into its proper form. The horse operation grew to a point where it was known in the territory, and buyers came from as far as Albuquerque and Santa Fe for what came out of the Hunter Corral, horses that were handled right from the start and showed it in their disposition and their reliability. The kitchen garden became a proper small orchard with fruit trees added along the south wall of the property, and in a good year the apples and apricots were more than they could use, and the surplus went to Abe Tully's store and then, as Cedar Creek grew, to a small proper market that opened on the main street in 1886. Cedar Creek did grow, which was both an occasion for satisfaction and an occasion for the adjustment that all growth requires in the people who were there before it. New families arrived every year, and the church got a proper building, and the school that had been operating in someone's barn for years moved into a real schoolhouse in 1887, which was the year James, at 3 years old, was too young for it, but which meant that by the time he was ready, there would be a proper place for him to learn. They acknowledged, as the years moved, the realities of what it meant to be building a life in the Southwest Territory, the complicated and often painful negotiations of land and rights that attended the ongoing settlement of a place that had its own people in it long before the homesteaders arrived. Elijah had been aware of this from his years working alongside Thomas, from the conversations they had had on fence lines, and in corrals about what it meant to have a history of this land that ran deeper than any deed filed in Tucson. He did not pretend that these things were simple or resolved. He tried to conduct himself with the clarity that Thomas's quiet example had taught him, which was that respect was not a gesture but a practice, enacted in small choices made consistently over time. Thomas remained part of their operation for all those years, and became something that was not quite described by any of the words available, which was perhaps because he occupied a space in their life that was genuinely its own thing, not hired man, not family in any formal sense, but a person without whom the life they had built would have been materially different and lesser, and who was known as such. In the spring of 1886, their second child was born, also a boy, whom they named William Thomas Hunter, the Thomas in deliberate recognition, and when they told Thomas the baby's middle name, the expression on his face was brief and controlled and was one of the few times Elijah had seen him unguarded. William was, from the beginning, nothing like his brother. Where James was serious and observant, William was noise and motion and laughter, pulling at everything and afraid of nothing, the kind of child who required attention the way the desert required water, constantly and urgently. James, at 2 years old when William arrived, looked at his new brother with an expression of profound wariness, And then, over the following weeks, with a growing and tentative protectiveness, that was one of the loveliest things either of his parents had witnessed. Life on the East Road homestead in those years had the quality of fullness. Full of work and full of children, and full of the daily negotiations of two people who loved each other, and were also genuinely different in some ways that required ongoing attention. Elijah was quieter than Sarah and more likely to need solitude after extended social occasions. Sarah was more likely to push through discomfort on the strength of principle, and sometimes needed to be reminded that rest was also a form of work. He occasionally went too long without saying things she needed to hear said. She occasionally said too many things at once when the important thing needed its own room. They worked these things through with the same honesty they had applied to everything from the beginning, imperfectly and consistently, which was the right way. On their 5th anniversary, February of 1888, Elijah came home from Cedar Creek with a package that he set on the table in the way of a man who was trying to appear casual and was not quite managing it. Sarah opened it and found a silver frame, and in it he had put the first letter she had ever written him, the letter she had written when he was on the cattle drive, the one she had not known where to send, the one he had read on her porch the day he came back and then folded and put over his heart. She looked at it for a long time, holding it in both hands. "I had it framed," he said, which was obvious but which was his way of filling the silence. "Elijah," she said. "I thought it should be somewhere it could be seen," he said. "It was the beginning of everything." She set the frame down on the table and crossed the room to him, and held him with the full strength of someone who knew exactly who they were holding and why it mattered. And he held her back with his face in her hair, and the smell of the desert coming through the open window, and the sounds of James and William doing something noisy in the other room. And he thought, clearly and without reservation, that this was the life he had not known to want when he was young, and that he would not trade for any other life that had ever been on offer. In the summer of 1888, Sarah was expecting their third child, and this pregnancy was different from the previous two in small ways that she noticed, and that the doctor in Tucson, still Dr. Harmon, who had become a familiar and trusted figure, confirmed were normal variations and nothing to be concerned about. She was tired earlier in the day and more careful about the garden work in the heat, and Elijah took on the heavier tasks without comment and without making it into a thing that needed discussing, which was the right approach and which she acknowledged one evening with a quiet, "Thank you for not making it a production." "You thanked me for returning a brooch once," he said. "I thought that was enough thanking between us. We can just do things for each other." She looked at him with the full warmth of 5 years and 2 children and every morning and evening they had built, and she said, "How did you become this person?" "Which person?" he asked. "The right one," she said. Their third child was a girl, born in November of 1888, and they named her Alice Me Hunter, the Me from Daniel's daughter, a name they had agreed on one evening in September while James and William were asleep, and the fire was low, and the night was the particular quiet of late fall in the desert. Alice arrived into the family with the absolute authority of a youngest child who has observed from the womb that attention is the primary resource, and who intends to secure as much of it as possible. She was her mother's green eyes and her father's brown hair, and James's serious mouth and William's gift for noise, all at once, and she made the household complete in the way that the last piece of a thing completed it, not because there was something missing before, but because this was the shape it was supposed to arrive at. Clara and Will came to visit the week after Alice was born, with their own son, a 2-year-old named Sam, who was Will's red hair and Clara's directness, all compressed into a small person who ran at everything. And the East Road homestead was briefly full of the specific beautiful chaos of extended family, children and adults, and the smell of cooking and the sound of voices overlapping. And Elijah stood in the doorway between the main room and the outside, and watched it all for a moment. This life. This assembled and particular and improbable life, and was grateful for it with every part of himself. He went back inside and found Sarah in the kitchen, nursing Alice while watching over the stew pot and listening to something Clara was saying with the full attention she brought to everything. And she caught his eye as he came in and gave him that small private smile, the one that was only ever for him, and he smiled back with everything he had. The silver brooch lived on the mantel in the evenings when she was not wearing it, beside the framed letter and the daguerreotype of her mother, and a small carved wooden horse that Thomas had made for James, and that James had solemnly declared was the best horse he had ever seen. It caught the firelight in the evenings, that small spray of leaves with the turquoise center, and in the morning Sarah pinned it to whatever she was wearing, which was not always a Sunday dress and was sometimes an apron and sometimes a work shirt, but always somewhere it could be seen. It was her mother, and it was the trail, and it was a paint horse with good eyes, and it was the beginning of everything that mattered. In the spring of 1889, when James was 5 and had started in the Cedar Creek School and came home every day with fistfuls of new information that he delivered with the gravity of a small professor, he asked his father one evening while they were sitting on the porch watching the last of the sunset, "How did you meet Mama?" Elijah considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, which was considerable. "I found something she had lost," he said. "What did you find?" "A brooch, a silver one. Her mother had given it to her. It fell off on the trail and she did not know it was gone until I brought it back." James thought about this. "Where did you find it?" "On the trail south of here." "About 8 miles. Did you know it was hers?" "No, I found out it was hers by asking in town." James was quiet for a moment, processing this the way he processed everything, slowly and completely. "So you rode all the way out here just to give it back?" "I did." "And then what happened?" "She invited me to stay for supper," Elijah said. James looked at him with the focused green eyes that were his mother's eyes. "And you stayed?" "I stayed," Elijah said. James thought about this for another long moment, looking out at the desert going purple in the dusk, with the particular gravity of a 5-year-old who is assembling something important from available parts. "That was good that you stayed," he said finally. "Yes," Elijah said, looking out at the same purple desert, hearing through the walls of the house the sounds of Sarah and William and Clara who had come for supper with Will and Sam, hearing the specific music of all of it, of the life assembled from a single good decision made on a dusty trail in August on the strength of a woman's name scratched into silver. "That was the best thing I ever did." The years that followed added to the life they had built in the incremental and beautiful way that good lives are added to. With the children growing and the horse operation expanding, and the kitchen garden becoming the kitchen orchard, and the kitchen orchard becoming something that people in Cedar Creek and beyond talked about when they talked about what was possible in desert country if you were patient enough. James grew into a young man with his mother's directness and his father's patience, and William grew into a young man with his father's skill with animals and his mother's humor, and Alice grew into a young woman who had taken the full combined inheritance of both parents and run with it in directions neither of them had predicted, but both of them recognized as entirely her own. Thomas worked alongside them for 17 years in total, until his own life called him north to his family's land, and when he left, there was a difficulty in the leaving that none of them put entirely into words, but that was felt. The loss of a presence that had been so constant it had become indistinguishable from the place itself. He returned to visit twice in the following years, and on the second visit he brought a young man with him, a nephew who had his same quality of quiet attention, and who turned out to have the same gift for horses, and who stayed on at the Hunter operation as Thomas had always said he would. Cedar Creek grew into a proper town over those years, adding a second general store and a bank, and eventually a newspaper that came out twice weekly, and in which Elijah appeared on one occasion as the subject of a brief profile about successful small operations in the territory, a profile he found embarrassing, and that Sarah kept in the box with the framed letter and the important papers. In 1898, 15 years after they had married in the pine-smelling church on Valentine's Day, they rode the same east road on a Saturday morning in February, and Elijah pointed out the spot where the cottonwood at the fork had been replaced by a younger tree, the original having come down in a storm 7 years earlier. And Sarah said she had always meant to plant a new one in exactly that spot and had somehow never gotten to it. "We could do it today," he said. "We could," she said. They went into Cedar Creek for their Saturday supplies, and at Abe Tully's store, which was now run by Abe's son George, who had the same gray whiskers his father had developed at the same approximate age, they asked about a cottonwood sapling, and George happened to have 3 in the back from a shipment of nursery stock, and they brought one home and planted it that afternoon at the fork of the East Road. James and William and Alice doing the majority of the digging, while Elijah and Sarah stood and watched with the particular pleasure of parents watching their children do something useful and good. When it was planted and watered, the 4 of them stood back and looked at it, small against the desert sky, a beginning. "It will be 15 years before it looks like anything," Alice said, with the practical assessment that was very much her mother's. "15 years is nothing," Elijah said, putting his arm around Sarah's shoulders. 15 years goes like that." Sarah looked at the small tree and then at him, and then at the 3 people they had made together, grown and growing, standing in the February afternoon light. "Like that," she agreed, and covered his hand with hers where it rested on her shoulder, and the silver brooch at her collar caught the February sun. And all along the East Road, the desert was doing what it always did in February, gathering itself for the spring that was already on its way. And the life they had built from a single good afternoon and a supper invitation, and a decision to stay went on and on around them, solid and real and theirs.